I think he grew in popularity from 1981 onwards, right up until now. Incredibly popular. And it's just because people felt that if they saw him at the football or the races or in the street, they could just say, "G'day, Bob," and feel that they weren't going to be shunned in any way. That, one of the most remarkable things about him was the discipline. He had a drinking problem, clearly, before he went into politics. And yet he was determined to succeed as Prime Minister, and so he didn't touch a drop, not for 8 years. And of course, had he had a drink, you would have known about it. He had this great mate in Melbourne called Cole Cunningham, who owned a small bus company and played golf with him. And Cole Cunningham once said that, they say that beer destroys the brain. Well, Bob Hawke disproved that, because he said he's still got his marbles when he should be a raving lunatic, and that's the sort of, that's where he was, and yet he governed successfully for 8 years, and it's remarkable, really.
Barry, was he a born leader?
Well, I think his parents thought so, and they put that thought in his mind very early on, and I think he signed up to it at a very early age. So he felt he was a born leader. There was inevitability about it. He once ran for the seat of Corio, and it was in the early 60s, and he lost. He lost that battle, but again, it's a great Australian story, because during that battle for Corio, staff approached him and said, "Kennedy's dead." And he said, "What? Graham Kennedy has just died." and that tells you he was an Aussie. He was an Aussie first. Kennedy had died. He thought Graham Kennedy. But I tell that story because he got off to that sort of start. He lost. He lost the battle for Corio, and then all those years later, after he'd been ACTU president, he made another run. And from the moment that he went into Parliament, I think it was inevitable that he was going to be leader. There was a lot of resistance to it, and people were very loyal to Bill Hayden right up until the end. But once he took it on, he made every post a winner.
Barry, I'm interested to know how he managed to woo you onto his team. Given certainly there was that famous interview or the exchange between yourself and Bob Hawke, where he called you a serial pest.
Well, that was after a by-election in Melbourne, the Flinders by-election, and it went very badly for Bill Hayden. And I turned up at Channel 9 because he'd just done an interview there and the issue wasn't raised. And I said to him coming out of the building, that surprised me. And he said, "Well, away you go." So I asked a couple of questions and said, you could kill this leadership speculation stone dead. And I persisted, and he called me a bloody pest and walked away. I went up to the car and I said, "You were fairly animated," and he said, "Well, you've got the interview." You see, that's the way politics works. He thought, if I'm going to be on the bulletin tonight, I've got to go in pretty hard, and that's the way he operated. That's the way politicians operate. They have to get attention. But we went from that. He wouldn't have even recalled it. He wouldn't have known who I was, who that person was in the street that day. And he approached me, I don't know, maybe 84, 85. To his press secretary, and I knocked it back with only getting started, really. And then they asked me again a couple of years later, and I just figured that if I really felt at the time that he was going to be somebody special in Australian political history, and if I was ever going to see politics from the inside, then this was my one chance.
And from the inside, was he a calm operator when you were in his office?
Yeah, a calm operator. I had one problem with him, and that was on day one, when I kind of famously threw some rubbish in the bin, not realising what it was. He'd done 4 hours sorting out his form guide. He marked every horse in every race in Brisbane, Melbourne and Sydney according to the weather and the jockeys and the time and the whole bit, and I'd thrown the whole bit in the bin. He did say to one or two other staff that,
Barry,
how stupid is he? Barry, but there you go. I got over that.
So, Barry, if you just hold on a moment, we're going to take you live to Sydney, where Craig Emerson is speaking.
Many war era. He died peacefully at home at the age of 89 years. I and Bob's children, Sue, Steve and Roslyn, and stepson Louis, and his grandchildren will hold a private funeral. A memorial service will be held in Sydney in coming weeks. Bob Hawke and Paul Keating and their governments modernised the Australian economy, paving the way for an unprecedented period of recession-free economic growth and job creation. Bob's consensus-style approach of bringing together the trade union movement and the business community boosted job opportunities while increasing the social wage through Medicare and extra financial support for low-income families. Together with his highly talented cabinets, Bob foresaw the Asian century and positioned Australia to take full advantage of it through a program of sweeping economic reforms. Among Bob's proudest achievements were large increases in the proportion of children finishing high school, his role in ending apartheid in South Africa, and especially his successful international campaign to protect Antarctica from mining. Bob abhorred racism and bigotry. His father, the Reverend Clem Hawke, told Bob that if you believed in the fatherhood of God, then you must also believe in the brotherhood of man. Bob would add today the sisterhood of women. Bob was dearly loved by his family and so many friends and colleagues. We will miss him. The golden bowl is broken. Bill.
I would like to thank Craig Emerson and Blanche de Pilge for asking me to say a few words on behalf of the Labor Party and the Labor movement. Tonight, the nation and Labor are in mourning. We have lost a favourite son. Bob Hawke loved Australia, and Australia loved Bob Hawke. But his legacy will endure forever. Bob Hawke changed Australia for the better. He brought people together. He brought Australia together. He modernised our economy. He transformed our society. He protected our environment. I last had the privilege of seeing Bob last week on his back veranda, sitting out there with his beloved Blanche, supported by Craig. He had his son, the sun on his face, had a crossword in front of him, a cup of tea. He didn't speak about himself to me. He did as he always does. Asked about the ALP and the election. We all loved Bob Hawke. We'll miss him a great deal. May he rest in peace. The condolences of my party and my movement to the great Bob Hawke.
And that's where we will leave Bill Shorten, the Labor leader, speaking in Sydney tonight, offering his condolences. He was joined there by the former Labor Minister, Craig Emerson, who has been spending a lot of time with Bob Hawke in recent days. Bill Shorten saying that tonight the nation and Labor are in mourning, that we have lost our favourite son, that Bob Hawke loved Australia and Australia loved Bob Hawke.
Let's bring Barry Cassidy back in. Barry, obviously both Craig Emerson there and Bill Shorten very moved and emotional tonight.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary day, really, for the Labor Party, isn't it, when you think about it? I mean, Bill Shorten was out there today with, where Gough Whitlam gave the famous "It's Time" speech. And then Bob Hawke with what a sense of timing. You know, Craig Emerson mentioned one thing there too that I don't think I'd mentioned before. That was the mining in Antarctica. You know, when that issue first came up, it'd be so easy for political leaders to say, well, that's I've got so much on my plate domestically, you know, I don't tackle that. But that's, again, I think what characterised him. He was proactive. He was prepared to go out and take on a challenge when others might not. And he again, without flagging it in this way, he went off to Paris. He saw the French president, and then he enlisted Jacques Cousteau, told him what he was trying to do, and then 18 months later that they stopped that mining and didn't go ahead in Antarctica. So again, I think it told you something about the way that he operated. Yeah,
that was a sort of signal to shift in the times in Australia. You talk about Antarctica, but also the Franklin and stopping the damming of the Franklin.
Yeah, and that was, that wasn't such a difficult thing for him to do. It was different in that sense because I think he knew that despite what Tasmanians felt about it, it was going to be an enormously popular decision on the mainland, and it proved to be. But that was the first thing he did. I mean, he stopped the Franklin Dam, and I think he benefited at the polls in 1983 precisely because of that.
Barry, when was the last time you saw Bob Hawke?
Well, a few months ago now, and Craig Emerson, who you just heard from, it would have been a week or two ago. He said to me, "You really should come and see him sooner rather than later," and I didn't. I didn't because of the campaign. I was going to do it after the campaign, and I didn't.
Well, Barry, please don't be too hard on yourself about that. You just never know when these things will happen, so don't be tough on yourself when it comes to that. Your final thoughts on what Bill Shorten had to say there? He went on to say how Bob Hawke modernised the economy, he transformed Australian society and protected the environment. Yeah,
and I think a simple statistic, when he came into office in 1983, retention rates in Australia were at 30%, one of the lowest retention rates in the developed world. 8 years later, that retention rate was 70%, from 30 to 70%. Imagine the difference that made to the economy. Imagine the difference that made to the country.
Barry, we do appreciate your thoughts tonight. Thanks very much for joining us.
Pleasure. Thanks.
Well, let's bring on our political editor, Andrew Probyn, who's at Parliament House. Andrew, what an amazing turn of events tonight. Can I ask you first on your thoughts? You've been covering politics for quite some time. Where does Bob Hawke sit in the pantheon of Australian leaders?
Well, he's sitting right at the very top of Labor's pantheon as a transformational figure both to the Australian economy, its environment, as we've heard, and also to politics. He was that larrikin who became Australia's greatest loved Prime Minister. He had amazing popularity for so long, but the transformation under his leadership between those years, right up until 1991, alongside Paul Keating, they were huge years. The economy changed in so many ways that we take for granted. It was a time when we had banks sold, privatisation processes started. We had the concept of the social wage introduced, a social wage which then not just talks about the take-home pay, but also what Australians should accept in services, Medicare. So he is an enormous figure, and the timing, as Barry was saying before, is quite acute because in that its time speech, if you look at the old footage of 1972 in that hall, Bob Hawke is there listening to Gough Whitlam talk, and we had Bill Shorten in the same hall today echoing some of those themes about the value and need for change, but he's also, Bill Shorten has been presenting himself as that consensus type leader, the man who will bring together some difficult changes but do so in a collegial and consensus manner. So it's a very big day. The timing is utterly acute. It transforms the last day of the election campaign. We'll go to vote on May 18, or a considerable number do, of course.
So, Andrew, what is the likely impact on the election?
Well, I think that there's going to be obviously some reflection. It's a day of reflection and celebration of a great man's life. We're already seeing some tributes flowing. Let's begin with Scott Morrison. He's taken Twitter and says that Bob Hawke was a great Australian who led and served our country with passion, courage and an intellectual horsepower that made our country stronger. He was true to his beliefs in the Labor tradition and defined the politics of his generation and beyond. But Paul Keating, who had a great professional relationship with Bob Hawke, but then had a somewhat of a falling out, let's say, over the leadership. But they obviously got back together and were in recent years and months. In fact, Paul Keating was talking about this to me just some days ago about how he and Bob Hawke had transformed the economy. He's also put a statement out saying that with Bob Hawke's passing today, the great partnership I enjoyed with him passes to a partnership we forged with the Australian people. But what remains and what will endure from that partnership are the monumental foundations of modern Australia. It's a lengthy statement, but it goes to that transformation that we've seen in the economy, that goes from everything from the floating of the dollar to some of the structures of government that we all take for granted.
Yeah, tell us a little bit more about that professional relationship that Paul Keating and Bob Hawke had.
Well, Bob Hawke came to power in extraordinary circumstances. Malcolm Fraser thought that he had Bill Hayden's measure, and just when he was, this is the days obviously before Twitter, before social media, before mobile phones, and thought that he would call the election pronto to pounce on Bill Hayden. Well, Bob Hawke was installed as Labor leader by Labor, and Malcolm Fraser, I should say, was sprung with this very popular Labor leader who came to power in extraordinary circumstances. He then brought forward an agenda in government that transformed many things. There was, of course, issues like the Franklin Dam that proved to be quite popular in mainland Australia. Tasmania, it was mixed, but some of that agenda he brought to government, shared with Paul Keating, were ones that were difficult, obviously, and also running counter in some ways to the Labor message. In fact, on that point, there is an interesting statement that has been issued from Tony Abbott, who points to he calls Bob Hawke as the greatest Labor leader. He said Bob Hawke was a great Prime Minister, Tony Abbott says today. In my judgment, he was Labor's greatest Prime Minister. And this is, this is a nice statement because he goes on, but his key achievements, financial deregulation, tariff cuts, and the beginnings of privatisation went against the Labor grain, as Labor's more recent policy direction shows. Well, there's a bit of a spiky comment. You might also say that he had a Labor heart but a Liberal head. So there's a typically Tony Abbott statement that talks of his admiration, but also admiration for some of the traits he wished that perhaps the Liberal Party had also showed.
He was very much a reforming Prime Minister, wasn't he? Because he came after the Fraser years, where Malcolm Fraser was criticised for not doing enough, and that Bob Hawke and Paul Keating had a very non-Labor policy platform when they essentially came to office and started implementing it.
Well, they came to office and they felt that the economy was not running on all cylinders and it needed modernising. If we go back again to 1972, Gough Whitlam had this enormous agenda, an agenda which he and Lance Barnard for 2 crazy weeks tried to implement with these 2 men at the beginning of the term in 1972, trying to run 27 portfolios between them, doing all sorts of things to try and change the economy. Now, of course, the events of 75 saw that all come crashing down, and then followed Malcolm Fraser. And with Malcolm Fraser, there was a sense that some of that modernising verve had left, and that's where the opportunity. Bob Hawke saw the opportunity. He was tempted to pitch for Parliament earlier. Of course, we know that he pitched for Parliament in the 60s, but he also saw opportunity in the late 70s. But hellfire and jumped when he could in the early 80s.
You're just on that point, Andrew, I might mention a statement from former Labor Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. He said Bob Hawke is a giant of Australian politics. He and Paul Keating internationalised the Australian economy. He established APEC and radically deepened Australia's engagement with Asia. And he established Medicare together with Therese and the entire nation. I mourn his passing. Lauded by politicians of all colours.
Absolutely, and we can expect more of that tomorrow, because he was a figure that was of great warmth and hilarity, a great sense of humour. I never really got to know him very well. I spoke to him on occasions, but always on the sidelines and long after he was Prime Minister. So I didn't work in this building where he was the first Prime Minister, in fact, to move into this building. We are sitting in, I'm sitting in Parliament House in Canberra, a building that was opened in the late 80s when the Prime Minister was Bob Hawke. Now, it was his love of a laugh, a love of people. He had some strong views on apartheid that saw him a topic and theme that carried him through the 60s and into the 70s. He had a strong interest in Africa, and he had a strong interest in Europe and the way that NATO should run. So there's going to be, I expect, a whole series of statements from people that he came across and grew to know.
Wayne Swan, the president of the Australian Labor Party and a former Labor treasurer, said that Bob Hawke, he's put out a statement saying Bob Hawke was working class to his bootstraps and he always kept those boots on. Above all, he was always Australian, a man of destiny, and it was our luck that destiny was fulfilled. You heard
sorry, I might just jump in there too, Karina. Anthony Albanese, obviously Labor frontbencher, he said that a Labor legend has passed tonight. Bob Hawke showed us how to govern and transform modern Labor.
You heard earlier Andrew Probyn, as we did from the former Labor Minister Craig Emerson, who had been spending a lot of time with Bob Hawke over these last few months, and we heard from the Labor leader, Bill Shorten, as well. What do you make of their comments in reflection on Bob Hawke's life and achievements? Craig Emerson talked about him lifting high school completion rates, his role in ending apartheid and protecting Antarctica from mining.
Well, they both spoke with great love. Craig Emerson, of course, worked alongside Bob Hawke for some time. Now, what was interesting is that he noted that Bob Hawke foresaw the Asian century, and he said that he positioned Australia to take full advantage of it with a program of sweeping reforms. Now, this is obviously of strong interest to modern Australia, the emergence of China in particular, and that would be Kevin Rudd's interest in this as well, and his admiration for Bob Hawke has been along along those grounds, because Kevin Rudd has spoken of warmly about the way that Bob Hawke saw not only our neighbours as an economic importance, but also the emergence of these superpowers and emergence of opportunities in trade and relations.
Andrew, today's politicians are often criticised for always being on message, for being too controlled, lacking personality. Bob Hawke was cut from a different cloth.
He was. One might say it was maybe easier in those days because we didn't have the social media that's relentless. We didn't have the 24-hour news that can both consume, analyse, regurgitate and want more also quickly. Bob Hawke was a master of the message, but in those times he was someone who could use the media masterfully. anyone of certain vintages can't forget when Australia won the America's Cup, for example, wearing that ridiculous jacket and saying that anyone who criticises people for being late as a mug, or a bum, I think it was. I can't quite remember.
Any boss who sacked their workers for not turning up to work the next day.
I remember being on a railway station going to school. That shows my vintage, but they were playing that over the loudspeaker down in Melbourne. So, these sorts of moments in time were captured well by the larrikin that was Bob Hawke, but a man who was masterful in man management, and I think that's been reflected in some of the reflections that we've heard today about the way that he could be that consensus leader, listen to everyone's perspectives and then come to a conclusion.
Probyn, if you stay with us, let's bring in Mark Kenny, who's in our Parliament House studio. He's a senior fellow at ANU. Mark Kenny, your thoughts tonight on the passing of Bob Hawke?
Well, I think there's a sense, Karina, that sort of history just shifted. Bob Hawke is such a transformational figure in the Australian story. He was a very important Prime Minister, Labor's longest-serving Prime Minister. He forged that partnership with Paul Keating that was such a successful one and such a powerful one beyond the mere numbers of those two men, but really created something quite significant in Australian history. And I think the fact that Bob Hawke has now died is one of those moments where you realise that the eras are moving on, and we don't see figures like that anymore. We won't see his like anymore, I suspect.
We're just reflecting with Andrew about how this changes the election campaign with just one day to go.
Yeah, it's a little hard to say. I guess it is a real kind of bombshell to occur right on at the end of the election campaign. Really, one full day of campaigning to go, and you can't imagine that all that much seems that serious or that urgent when this is happening. I mean, the news of Bob Hawke's death came out while the two interviews were running on 7:30. That is of Scott Morrison and then Bill Shorten, and really, it just seemed to overwhelm those statements. It's not that the election's unimportant, I'm not suggesting that, but the passing of Bob Hawke, I think it is a big moment for the nation, a very sad moment. Of course, it has to come to us all in the end, but nonetheless, and he was quite old, but we weren't expecting this, and it's a significant, I think, atmospheric change about Australian politics right now, at the end of an election campaign.
What are your reflections, Mark, on what his legacy will be?
Well, I think a number of people have talked about the various achievements of him. I mean, he was they talk about him as the larrikin Prime Minister, or as someone who could bring parties together. But he was such a successful politician. He was such a rounded politician. This is the thing that you don't see so much anymore. He was known for his fierce intellect, but is also known for his incredible ease in dealing with people, his genuine affection for people, for social events. He was extraordinarily popular right across the electorate. I remember in 1983 when he was elected, there was an overwhelming sense of optimism in the country, because Bob Hawke, even by then, had developed this reputation as someone who could make things happen. As Barry was saying before, he would come into, in his role as an ACTU union official, he would come into disputes at the last minute, and he would be able to bring the parties together and drive some sort of rational response, some agreement that was based on this idea of consensus. And he was really Mr. Consensus, and that's the way he ran the government. He ran a proper collective cabinet government. It was the cabinet meetings were exhaustive. They were rigorous. They had a proper delineation between ministers, between departments, and they actually got things done. And I think when history looks at the stacks up governments and compares them, it'd be very hard to go past the Hawke and then Keating period, and Keating, of course, was such an important figure in the Hawke government as well. It'll be hard to go past those that whole period, 13 years of Labor government, largely brought by Bob Hawke, for both the number of reforms and just the orderly way in which those things happened.
Mark Kenny, just stay with us. We are seeing some live pictures coming to us from Brisbane Airport, where we're expecting the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, to make a statement on the death of Bob Hawke. He has put out a written statement saying Australia mourns the passing of its 23rd and third longest serving Prime Minister, the Honourable Robert James Lee Hawke. Profoundly Australian, Bob Hawke was a conviction politician who became a political legend. Bob Hawke was a great Australian who led and served our country with passion, courage and an intellectual horsepower that made our country stronger. He was true to his beliefs in the Labor tradition and defined the politics of his generation and beyond.
Well, let's get some more recollections of Bob Hawke from someone who knew him very well. Susan Ryan is the former Aged Care Discrimination Commissioner and the first minister assisting the Prime Minister for the status of women in Bob Hawke's government in 1983. She joins us now. Susan, thanks for joining us. You must have many emotions at this point and, of course, a lot of memories.
Well, my first emotion is a huge sense of loss. I mean, we knew that Bob was ill and he wouldn't last much longer, but I still feel that devastating sense of loss of someone who meant something to the nation but meant a lot to me and my work in politics. And I'm also devastated that he didn't last till the 18th, for the possibility of something which would have been fabulous for him. But there is no one like Bob Hawke, and there never will be. But the brilliance with which he moved into the Prime Ministership, and remember it was very sudden. Bill Hayden had been our very good and capable leader, but at the last minute we switched to Bob Hawke and we won the election. And although we, the front bench, had known Bob a bit, I hadn't known him so much because I didn't come from the trade union movement with her. Well, he's very popular, he's been a great union advocate. What's he going to be like as Prime Minister? So we went into our first cabinet meeting thinking, what's this going to be like? Well, it was top performance from day one. Everything orderly, he'd read every submission, he conducted the meetings in a collegiate way but very purposeful. You always knew you had to be prepared, but if you were prepared you could have the opportunity to express your views. The whole thing was so systematic, so policy-driven, and really, although we had robust discussions, you'd have to say, so successful as a way of running the country. And I consider it the highlight of my life that I was part of it, really.
And why was it that he was so successful in that consensus that drove his government? And you mentioned that in your own cabinet meetings. He brought everyone together.
Yes.
You're all working together. How did he achieve that?
Well, he had a very powerful intellect, and you have to pay that. He understood and had read and analysed everything we were trying to do in education or women or foreign affairs. He had it all. But he also had a very persuasive personality. He was very used to winning a negotiation. All those years in the ACTU, you guys are a bit too young to remember that, but there'd be these massive strikes paralysing Australia. Bob, as leader of the ACTU, would go in, he'd meet with the employers, he'd meet with the unions. He always got a good outcome. He was a brilliant negotiator, and he always, it's like being a great musician or something. He just had that talent. He could say, we want to get there, you don't want to get there, you don't want to get there, we want to get there, what do we have to do to get there? And he understood that you can't bully people into getting where you want to be. You have to persuade them, you have to listen to them, but you have to have your objective. And he always had his objective, and usually he achieved it. And it was absolutely instructive. I felt I did about 10 PhDs just watching the way he managed it all.
Susan Ryan, what did he do for women as Prime Minister?
Well, I'm glad you asked, because a lot of the attention is on the economy, the floating of the dollar, the deregulation, the banks, all of that stuff, the Accord, the industrial relations, the restructuring of Australian manufacturing industry, big advances in our foreign policy. But he did lots for women. And I have to say, as the minister who was responsible, he always supported me. Other cabinet ministers would say, do we really want to do this? Is it time to do it? Will it frighten the horses? But Bob would say, no, equality for women is what we stand for. And, you know, as leader of the ACTU for many years, he had been the big voice supporting equal pay for women. So the idea of women having equality wasn't a novel idea. It was to some of my colleagues, I'd have to say, but not to Bob. So as soon as I said we don't want to do the sex discrimination legislation to make illegal refusing women jobs or loans or promotions because they were women or they were pregnant or they were married, he got it straight away. And he backed me. And so a lot of the advances for women, there were a lot in that time, he backed. I didn't have to do much argument to him. He always backed it. He saw the justice of it and he wasn't worried by it.
Do you see that as a watershed in Australian politics, and that you were brought into his government, other women were as well, that was a turning point?
Well, it was a turning point for women. I mean, I was the only woman in cabinet for all the time I was there. And at that stage, very little had happened legislatively or in policy terms to improve the disadvantage women were suffering from. So we did stacks. So we did lots in education, we did it in childcare, we did it in crisis centres for women. Women who had been in a very, very difficult position got a lot of opportunities. And he did it because he saw the logic of it and the fairness of it. And as I said, although I had to do a lot of argument and persuasion, even within the caucus and certainly beyond, Bob always got it. So it was a turning point. And Australian women have a lot to be grateful for that we had Bob as our leader for those years.
What kind of a family man was he?
Well, he was very emotionally engaged with his family, very attached to Hazel, his wife, and the children. But he wasn't the kind of family man that I suppose Australian women hoped that their husbands would be. Like, he wasn't there to take the kids to the football or whatever. But he was emotionally very engaged with them and very, very deeply bonded with them, and very distressed if anything went wrong, as it did in one case with one of his daughters. So I think he was a very committed man emotionally to his family, but in terms of time and turning up and so forth, not so much.
Yet he was very disciplined, wasn't he? We heard Barry Cassidy talk about this, that he obviously had a drinking problem. And he vowed, I think it was in 1980, long before he became Prime Minister, that he would give up the drink because he knew if he had that ambition to lead, that he couldn't possibly entertain those thoughts of having a drink. And that lasted for the entirety of his political career.
That's right. And it was quite remarkable, and I'm here to tell you, he stuck to it. And, you know, for a man who'd been a big drinking man and so forth, he just said, I'm not going to do it, and he didn't. And what I used to get really impressed by was that in those days, occasionally, you know, after a long cabinet meeting or a long caucus meeting, we'd go down to the bar and have a drink, and, you know, people would get a bit boring and tell jokes and stuff. And, you know, if you're not drinking yourself, usually you think, oh, I better go home. Bob would stay, he'd be just as gregarious, he'd be just as engaged, even though he himself said, I'm not drinking while I'm Prime Minister. And it was admirable discipline. I've never seen anyone do anything like that.
Yet he's often labelled as a larrikin. Would that still apply when he was Prime Minister, that he was a larrikin Prime Minister?
Well, he loved betting on the horses, and that didn't stop. And he didn't take any vow about that. And, you know, we had the marvellous Mick Young then in our cabinet, and he'd be saying to Mick, now what's happening on Saturday? And also Lionel Bowen, his deputy, was also a great GG's man. They'd always talking about what they were betting. So he kept up his betting interests, his sporting interests, which were huge. But the larrikin thing was partly to do with the fact that women loved him. Women chased him around everywhere. I can remember Mick Young coming back from something and said, God, you know, out with Hawke. the women won't leave him alone. Old ones, young ones, skinny ones, fat ones, they just all run after him. And that gave him the reputation of being, a womaniser. He liked women. But on the other hand, women liked him. So a lot of the stories about Hawke and women, not only was it informed consent, it was actually women chasing Bob around the place and Mick trying to fend them off.
Yeah, but from the same token, from men's point of view, he was seen as a great bloke. We see him on the sporting field there, mixing it with the blokes. Perhaps, and that was all part of the attraction, wasn't it? He attracted both men.
Women loved him, but men loved him because of his sporting prowess and his ease. There would be no situation in which Bob would be ill at ease.
So what does that say about a leader, that he can be both likeable but at the same time tough and powerful when he needed to be?
Well, it's the magic combination, isn't it? You can't be one or the other. And that's the challenge. I mean, there are many people who are likeable rogues and this and that, but you wouldn't want them running the country.
And you don't.
And there are many people who are quite disciplined and so forth, but they don't relate to people, so they're not too good at running the country either. So it was the magical combination that Bob had that we, as Australians, benefited from so much.
And do you think we're missing that in modern politics?
Well, I don't like to make an old feather duster's comment. I think it's very hard for any leader to compare themselves with Bob because he was so unusual and so talented. On the other hand, the spirit of what Bob was about, I think Labor today under Bill Shorten is pursuing very seriously. And as I said, I'm really distraught that in the event of a Labor victory on the 18th, 2 days away, Bob won't be there to enjoy it. So that's adding to my sense of distress.
Susan, we're told that the Prime Minister is about to step up, so excuse us if we have to stop you mid-sentence when he does. I'm sure you'll understand. Bob Hawke, the private man, and the public persona, were they the same?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I don't think Bob's a person who had compartments in his life. He was very emotional. He was very responsive. He was very intellectual. I don't think he was someone who said, I'm like this in public and I'm like this in private. So what you saw is what you get. Yeah, because, that's a criticism, of course, of today's politicians, that they're too stiff. And, that certainly applies to Bill Shorten too. Well, Bill, I think, is doing a terrific job. He's got a different personality. He hasn't got that great, expansive, emotional IQ thing happening. But I think at the same time, he is very conscious of the Labor tradition and the Labor leaders' tradition. And I think he's a worthy successor to Bob, but he's not the same as Bob. No one can be the same as Bob. I'm very sorry to have to say.
What about the relationship with Paul Keating, who's put out a touching statement tonight on Bob Hawke's passing? Look, I'm sure Paul will feel, as we all feel, a massive sense of loss. And see, I was in Cabinet from 83 to... We'll interrupt you now, Susan Ryan, and take you to Brisbane, where the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, is speaking.
All learned the news of the passing of one of Australia's great Prime Ministers, and certainly Labor's greatest Prime Minister, in my view. The 23rd Prime Minister of Australia, Robert James Lee Hawke. His achievements will be spoken of in the days ahead, but the thing Australians will remember most about him was the bloke. He made Australia stronger through his contribution to public life. He had a great intellect, he had enormous passion, and he had courage. And that was able to sustain him in being the longest serving Labor Prime Minister of all time. But it was his ability to connect with everyday Australians, with a word, with that larrikin wit, with that connection and an understanding of everyday Australian life, that we will most remember Bob Hawke. I want to extend to Bob's wife Blanche, on behalf of Jenny and I, deep personal sympathies and to all of Bob's family, and also to acknowledge the late Hazel Hawke as well. Bob lived a full life. He lived a rich life, and in his life he blessed many others. And for that, I think, as Australians, we can give him great thanks. One thing I remember amongst many, it was Bob Hawke who changed our national anthem to say, "Australians all, let us rejoice." And tonight, while I'm sure I extend to the Labor movement and to Bill Shorten and his party my deep sympathies on behalf of our political movement, I think we can all say, as Australians, that we rejoice in the life of Bob Hawke. We thank him for his service to our nation, and we pray now that he rest in peace. Thank you, Bob.
Scott Morrison on the death of Bob Hawke. Let's bring back our political editor, Andrew Probyn. Andrew, the Prime Minister there, referring to that change that Bob Hawke made on the national anthem of "All Let Us Unite."
That's right, and Scott Morrison was actually the target of one of Bob Hawke's recent acts. He jointly penned a statement with Paul Keating, not just a few days ago, about a week ago, and this statement was very critical of Scott Morrison, saying that Labor was incapable of managing the economy. In reading it, you think that Paul Keating had a fair bit to do with the statement, because it talked about Bob Hawke and Paul Keating inheriting a sclerotic financial market, and one that needed a fair bit of work done to it. Talked about how the centrally arbitrated wage system needed to be changed. So Scott Morrison there reflecting on some of the vast changes that were done during the Hawke-Keating period, but these are the very themes that Bob Hawke sought to in his statement with Paul Keating. He said that these were the themes that Bill Shorten would be advancing should he win the next election. He said that in this statement, he said that the baton of reform is being grasped by the next generation of Labor leaders, and that Bill Shorten's Labor Party presents the most comprehensive and well thought through agenda any opposition has provided to the Australian people. It is also an agenda that has become a big target for Scott Morrison. His attacks on some of these reforms that were firmly backed by Bob Hawke and Paul Keating, not just in print. Paul Keating also has taken to the airwaves to commend some of those changes. But today's events, the death of a Labor great, a Labor giant, a transformative figure, will in itself transform the last day of campaigning and affect it considerably, I would think.
Yeah, well, let's get some more on that and bring in our political reporter, Matthew Doran, who's been following the Labor Party campaign. He's in Brisbane for us tonight. Matthew, what's been the reaction on the campaign trail?
Well, it's been pretty swift, Karina. Of course, this was something that many people had been wondering might happen throughout the campaign. It was only a few weeks ago when Labor launched their official election campaign here in Brisbane that we saw a rare show of unity between the former Labor Prime Ministers of Australia, Paul Keating, Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd, sitting front row of the Labor campaign launch. But without Bob Hawke, his ill health was widely known. And just a few days ago, Bill Shorten, during a rally, had said that Bob and his wife Blanche were holding on for this election day, which is in less than 48 hours away. Unfortunately, he hasn't seen that, but the reaction from the Labor Party was quite quick. We saw, of course, Bill Shorten making a statement in Sydney. This incident has, of course, changed his travel plans. He was expected to be in Brisbane tonight alongside the Prime Minister, both men taking their campaigns to to Brisbane in the dying days of this election campaign, and we will wait to see how it affects Bill Shorten's campaign tomorrow. The other responses that we've seen coming through from Labor politicians, including Christina Keneally, who's posted a photo of herself and her then young son alongside Bob Hawke, talking of what an inspiration he was to her political career. We have seen countless posts on social media, statements coming out from former Prime Ministers, including Paul Keating, but also one that's come from Tony Abbott, former Liberal Prime Minister, and of course now just the backbench member for Warringah. He has said that Bob Hawke was one of Labor's, if not Labor's, greatest Prime Minister, but has suggested that some of his policies were more liberal in their stance than Labor, and that is something that many people are taking to on social media, criticising, saying that he is politicising the passing of this Prime Minister, Bob Hawke, a man with a considerable legacy, and saying that he should maybe rethink his thoughts there. But as I mentioned, we will wait to see how this affects the campaign in this final day of electioneering here in the Sunshine State. Bill Shorten likely to make his way here from Sydney sometime tomorrow morning.
Okay, Matthew Doran there in Brisbane. Let's bring in Peter Harcher now, who's political editor at the Sydney Morning Herald. Thank you for joining us tonight. Your reflections on the passing of Bob Hawke.
Well, I suppose talking to people in my kids' generation, they don't know anything about Hawke except that he's a knockabout bloke, which he was, and that he held a world record for drinking a yard glass of beer. Now, that's kind of harmless, warm and fuzzy stuff, but it's not about Bob Hawke. And a lot of the current generation of Australian politicians, I don't think, also appreciate what the real meaning of Bob Hawke was. They look at him with an envious eye as somebody who could be popular and loved, increasingly so as the years go by, and they envy that. Well, that's nice too. But what Hawke really was the antithesis of most modern politicians, and that was he was a problem solver. He wasn't just a show pony, although he was pretty good at that too. He was a problem solver at the ACTU, and remember, he rose to fame and popularity, great popularity, by solving strikes. He would go in and mediate, negotiate, and solve pressing problems. The public loved him for solving problems. He then took his problem-solving skills into the Parliament and into the government, and he and Keating together, and their cabinet, including Susan Ryan, who is talking to you here tonight, together took the greatest problem Australia was confronting, which was that we had a closed, rigid economy conceived a century earlier as a closed protectionist system. And Hawke and Keating broke that open. Now, that was very difficult and extremely unpopular. They were able to get away with that because Keating did the really difficult economic work of busting open the system, destroyed the tariff structure that had protected and cosseted Australian industry for a century, liberalised the price of money, interest rates, the financial sector, liberalised the exchange rate, the dollar, and liberalised labour, freed up the labour market. These were all deregulatory, pro-market steps.
Reforms that many people said Malcolm Fraser should have done.
Precisely. So what Hawke and Keating did was to take the problem, the biggest problem, and to solve it. And it was hard work, and it made them, especially Keating, as the Treasurer, unpopular, while Hawke used his popularity factor to keep winning elections. But you're right, Andrew. He took the biggest problem, and together the team took it on head on, regardless of the costs to their personal popularity. At the same time, Thatcher and Reagan were doing a similar deregulatory program in the US and the UK. The difference was they did it through confrontation. They did it by confronting the unions, having wars with the unions, smashing the unions, strikes, industrial ugliness, and they also ran up massive debt contrary to their political images.
Well, let's pick up that point, Peter, of how we got that done. And you mentioned that Susan Ryan is with us, a minister in the Hawke government. Susan, how did he solve or do that problem solving? Was he the sort of guy that you'd get into cabinet and he would bang the table and say, we've got to get this done?
No, he didn't bang the table. He hardly ever needed to bang the table. He'd do it by argument. There'd be someone would have a submission. We'd discuss the submission. If any minister hadn't read the submission, they would get the Hawke treatment. But he did it by understanding that we had to work collectively. And, Peter, you're talking about the smashing of the tariffs, which was extremely difficult for a Labor Party because a lot of our supporters and the people who relied on us worked in manufacturing. A lot of migrant women worked in textiles. They all lost their jobs. So
on that point,
yeah.
he won Liberal voters over. Did he lose Labor voters as a result of that?
Look, there was a lot of distress and people said, what are you doing? You're a Labor government, you're closing this factory, what are we going to do? But somehow, and really our relationship with the ACTU under Bill Kelty was key to this. Somehow we said, OK, you're losing your job there, but we'll train you for jobs here. And Bob would go and talk to people and say, look, we have to do this. At the time, it was very tough. It was very tough. And people who didn't have, Hawke's magnificent personality, a lot of my other cabinet colleagues think, oh, my God, how are we going to go and face the troops? But he knew it was right. But the difference between us and Reagan and Thatcher was we had to do that, but we also had to make sure that education, TAFE funding, special courses for migrant women who'd lost their jobs, operating sewing machines in Brunswick or something, that they got other opportunities. And people trusted him. When Bob went and said, look, this factory's going to close, but there are other opportunities, they didn't see him as just doing PR. They believed it, and we worked our guts out to make sure that that could happen, and that was the big difference. But it's very nice in my later years to have people say how wonderful it all was, because at the time, Peter, we had a lot of opponents, including from within. But Bob could take us through the whole thing. He had a great commitment to rationality. If this is the right policy, if this will produce the right results, then we just all have to do it. There was nothing kind of soft around the edges about him in policy terms. Emotionally, sure, with his kids and everything, but not in policy terms.
He was a hard man doing hard things.
Yes.
That was the inner core of the meaning of Hawke.
Yes.
There is Julia Gillard has tweeted, she's also put out a statement, and it says, Bob Hawke was the greatest peacetime leader Australia has ever had. As a teenager, Bob inspired me. As a PM, he guided me. I will miss him. I wish so very much that Bob had been able to see one more election day. My condolences to Blanche, his children and grandchildren. And Julia Gillard has put out a long statement on the death of Bob Hawke. That's in somewhat contrast to the statement that Tony Abbott has put out and is getting criticised for heavily on social media because there are some rather pointed statements in it, even though on the surface of it, it's a nice statement because he said Bob Hawke was a great Prime Minister. In my judgment, he was Australia's greatest Prime Minister. But he goes on to say that a lot of his achievements went against the Labor grain, as Labor's more recent policy direction shows. You might also say he had a Labor heart but a Liberal head. Susan Ryan, your reaction to that?
Nothing liberal about Bob. Nothing liberal about Bob. Absolutely. He was absolutely Labor through and through. He loved the Labor movement. He loved nothing more in his later years than getting together with union colleagues, singing Solidarity Forever, knowing all the verses. And it came from the heart, So the idea that he would advance and indeed create new directions in terms of deregulation, international trade and so forth, ably partnered by Paul Keating, was not Labor being liberal. It was just hugely intelligent understanding of the way the world was going and making decisions that would ultimately be best for all the people of Australia, but especially the working people. And that's Labor. It's not liberal.
And Peter, just very quickly, your response?
Well, it's Tony projecting ideology onto a bloke who did not see those problems as ideological. He saw it as a national problem that needed a national solution.
Okay, Peter Harcher, Susan Ryan, both stay with us, and we will bring you the news that one of the nation's most charismatic and popular Prime Ministers, Bob Hawke, has died today, aged 89. Mr Hawke led the country from 1983 to 1991.
As well as substantial economic and industrial relations reform, the Hawke era was also marked by environmental activism. There have been tributes today from Prime Ministers past and present.
In the spring of 1983, the nation and its new Prime Minister were high on America's Cup fever.
I tell you what, any boss who sacks anyone for not turning up to die is a bum.
Robert James Lee Hawke had swept to power just 6 months earlier. His victory over Malcolm Fraser was decisive, his rise to the Labor leadership even more swift and brutal.
I believe that a drover's dog could lead the Labor Party to victory.
Mr Hawke, could I ask you whether you feel a little embarrassed tonight at the blood that's on your hands?
You're not improving, are you? I thought you'd make a better start to the year than that. It's a ridiculous question, you know it's ridiculous. I have no blood on my hands.
During the 1980s, Bob Hawke walked all over a divided coalition. He defeated Andrew Peacock, John Howard and even the Joe for Canberra campaign. All in all, there would be 4 election victories over nearly 9 years in office, making him Labor's longest-serving Prime Minister.
Friends, this is a moment of pride and of gratitude.
Bob Hawke's political success and consensus style largely kept his ambitious treasurer Paul Keating in check. The pair combined in their pursuit of economic reform, floating the Australian dollar, dismantling tariffs and deregulating the banking system. But leadership tension inevitably unravelled their partnership, and in 1991, on his second attempt, the young challenger brought an end to the Hawke reign.
Paul Keating polled 5 votes ahead of Bob Hawke, 56 to 51. Thank you very much.
Bob Hawke was married to Hazel for nearly 40 years before they divorced in the mid-1990s, and he married his biographer Blanche Dalpuget. He was a Labor warrior until the end, campaigning for Kevin Rudd in 2007, then Julia Gillard in 2010.
Favourite son of the party, campaigning legend, ladies and gentlemen, Bob Hawke.
In his last press conference as Prime Minister, Bob Hawke was asked how he'd like to be remembered.
I guess as a bloke who loved his country, still does, and loves Australians, and who was not essentially changed by high office.
Let's bring back in Susan Ryan, former minister in the Hawke government. Susan, on that last point there, we saw that the final press conference as Prime Minister from Bob Hawke, he was obviously very emotional, as you'd expect. When he lost the Prime Ministership to his loyal deputy, Paul Keating, what effect did that have on him?
Well, he was heartbroken, but he didn't think it should happen. Despite all the stories, and I mean there's some basis to them, that there'd been an agreement that he would hand over to Paul. When the time came, he thought he was the best person to continue being Prime Minister, and he did not expect the caucus to throw him out. So he wasn't thrown out by the people. And I think that was a particularly hurtful thing for this collegiate man, this man of solidarity with comrades and so on, to be defeated in that way. And I think for a while he was very, very down. But he has the sort of, as you said, Peter, problem solving, I've got to get up and moving again. He sort of, it took him a while, but he got moving again. He established this extremely productive relationship with China, doing I think over 100 trade missions there. And the other thing, and this also goes to the completely wrong comment by Tony Abbott, he was always available to the party. Every election, even state elections, you'd see him, even with candidates who had no chance of winning, he'd be there making speeches, attracting people. He remained deeply loyal to the party despite the heartbreak of that moment.
There was that famous curability deal, of course, which Paul Keating said he broke. Did Bob Hawke hang on for too long, do you think?
Well, if he decided to go a bit earlier and gone voluntarily, of course it would have made it much easier for everyone, including Paul and including the party. And it would have led to many happy, Bob was the greatest celebrations that Labor does very well. But his view was he should hang on, and he hung on, so that in the end he was removed by the caucus, and that was a very deep pain to him, but it wasn't a pain that embittered him or made him paralysed about supporting Labor again. He dealt with it and got over it. But it's extraordinary, really, isn't it? Not many people could do that.
Well, as we've seen with recent Prime Ministers.
Saying nothing. It's the ABC.
Let's bring back in political editor Andrew Probyn in Parliament House. Andrew, the reaction to Bob Hawke's death is coming in thick and fast.
So Julia Gillard has put out a statement, but she also put out a nice, very personal tweet which reflects some of the sentiment in a statement. She said that Bob Hawke was the greatest peacetime leader Australia's ever had. As a teenager, Bob inspired me. As a PM, he guided me. I will miss him. I wish so very much that Bob had been able to see one more election day. My condolences to Blanche, his children and grandchildren. As Susan was saying, reflecting on, Bob Hawke did manage to restore that relationship with Paul Keating, and we did in fact see in the 2016 in when Kevin Rudd was last running as Labor leader, I should say, Bob Hawke and Paul Keating got together to back him in. Bob Hawke wasn't there the last of the election launches, being so unwell, but there was a lot of reflection on his legacy, both from the leaders and the folk assembled, but also Bill Shorten himself. He does very much see himself as a projection of that transformative soul that has been spoken of tonight. He thinks that he has got some of that agenda that continues that spirit of the Hawke-Keating years.
Back in now. In that statement from Julia Gillard that Andrew Probyn was referencing, he said, Julia Gillard said, when I last saw Bob, he was facing his own mortality with a sense of calm. He was ready and taking great comfort looking back on a life so well lived. Your response?
I mean, I've stayed in touch with Bob and Paul Keating, with both of them. It was very interesting that Bob remained warm and outgoing, and as Susan Ryan said earlier, always willing to jump into the Labor cause. Even just 2 weeks ago, putting out that joint statement with Paul Keating, claiming the ownership of the modern economy for the Labor Party. And as Keating said to me, he said, this is the first time Bob and I have shared a platform where we've both spoken in 28 years. So it was the Labor Party that gave them their opportunity, that gave them their opportunity to reshape the country, and finally brought them back together again. Could I also pick up on a word that Julia Gillard used in her tribute to Bob Hawke? She called him the greatest peacetime Prime Minister. And this is something about Bob that I don't think is widely appreciated or understood, especially among anybody under the age of 50 who wasn't around when Hawke was leader. And that is what he did with the US alliance. The US alliance, he wasn't content to just let it rest there and salute it, when American presidents came to visit. He took the centrepiece of the alliance, the modern functional centrepiece, which is the Pine Gap intelligence station, which is the way that the US looks for telltale early launch signs. If there's going to be a nuclear attack on the US, they need Pine Gap to see those, whether they're being launched from Russia, China or North Korea. And until Hawke and Beazley came along, the US kept that as a closed US installation where the Australians were on the periphery and weren't allowed into the centre. Hawke changed that. Hawke demanded and got equal Australian participation.
Now, we're joined from our Parliament House studio by Mark Kenny, Senior Fellow at the ANU's Australian Studies Institute and Director at the National Press Club. Mark, thanks for joining us again. Let's talk about Bob Hawke's electoral success. He won 4 elections. Obviously, the one where he toppled Malcolm Fraser in 1983, but he went back to the people almost 2 years later, and that was he received a bit of a scare then.
He did, that's right. I mean, the 83 election campaign was very successful. They had that slogan, bringing Australians together. And as I said before, there was this great sense of optimism. The government got moving with the Accord, and there was a lot to do. And there was a real sense about Labor, I think, at that time, that it was picking up some of the threads of what was done in that Whitlam period, but doing it properly. That is, learning from some of the mistakes, some of the excesses, some of the procedural sort of shortcomings, and doing it properly. But for whatever reason, Bob Hawke got quite confident then. He decided to go to an early election in 1984, so it was really only, I think, about 2 years into the term. And he had a very long election campaign, and much like an election campaign we saw Malcolm Turnbull run in 2016, it drifted. And really, in the end, Labor did get home, but it was, as you say, Andrew, a bit of a scare for Labor, and that did shake the confidence of some of his colleagues.
Mark, interesting you raised Malcolm Turnbull there. He's just tweeted and said that farewell Bob Hawke, a great Australian, Labor leader and reforming Prime Minister. Australia is a better place because of him. Lucy and I send our love and condolences to Blanche and all of his family. We've been touching on over the course of tonight just how this might affect how the election campaign plays out in its dying days. What impact do you think Bob Hawke's passing will have?
Well, I think it's really hard to tell, other than it has changed the atmosphere entirely. It perhaps is also drawing our attention, as I think you have through your questions, and a number of other guests have said tonight, have made reference to this sort of obvious comparison one finds oneself drawing between figures like Bob Hawke in particular, but also Paul Keating, and some of the politicians, or most of the politicians indeed, that we have now. There is a tendency, I suppose, a nostalgic tendency to romanticise these things, but as Peter Harcher said, Bob Hawke was really a Prime Minister intent on doing big things, and he did go about doing big things, and they went about it in a very orderly and creative way, and they brought all of the necessary people and forces together, and they got things done. They didn't duck fights. It wasn't government by a press release. And it was about a big Australia. We have debates going on at the moment. For example, some people argue we shouldn't do anything on climate change because Australia only represents a small amount of emissions. Bob Hawke would never have taken that attitude about a challenge. He always saw Australia's role as very large, and he was an enlarger of the country. So I think in the sense of the comparison between Bob Hawke and the election now, there is that feeling that perhaps politics has got a little bit more petty and a little bit more inward, and having a little less ambition in the whole process.
Peter, do you think the Hawke government came at a very strange time? Because it was during most of the 80s, of course, very conservative period. We had the Thatcher government in the UK, the Reagan administration in the United States, but here was a Labor government in Australia undertaking similar sort of reforms that we saw elsewhere in the world.
That's right. What they really did is they took off the ideological blinkers that most of today's generation of politicians would insist on wearing. They saw the problem in its own terms, and so yes, the program was the same. It was a very deregulatory program, but they were also innovators as well as reformers, and so the relationship that Hawke and Keating struck up with the ACTU, and Bill Kelty in particular, was one to have the change through a process of cooperation. Now, the biggest, hardest thing, and you won't hear this mentioned often because Labor doesn't like to talk about this, Hawke and Keating repressed wages. They actually sat hard on working Australians' wages. And they did that because one of the problems at the time was that there was a wage price inflation spiral going on that was sending the economy from boom to bust. And they said, we've got to stop this. So they came to a deal with the ACTU. If you help us to repress wage demands in the economy, and in real terms, that means Australian workers took, in real terms, a pay cut in those years, we will agree to compensation through the so-called social wage. And that's why we get compulsory superannuation today. The origin of compulsory super is Hawke and Keating saying, well, here's the social trade-off for your workers agreeing to a pay cut, and Medicare and many other elements as well. So yes, Andrew, it was a parallel program to Thatcher and Reagan with the same general trend of being pro-market and deregulatory, yet done in an Australian way, an innovative way, and
Now, of course, we're talking about the 80s. Bob Hawke being Prime Minister from, he took office in 1983. And not long after, we saw one of the most amazing moments in Australian, and it has to be said, world sport as well. And his response to Australia's historic America's Cup triumph in September 1983, which he watched from the confines of the Royal Perth Yacht Club.
I tell you what, any boss who sacks anyone for not turning up today is a bum. You have to work a bit harder the next day to make up. It's a day for all Australians, isn't it? It's a day that brings us all together. Marvellous. Absolutely marvellous.
Well, 1983 America's Cup winning skipper John Bertrand is joining us now on the phone. John, thanks for talking to us on this night where we're looking at the memory of Bob Hawke. When I think of the America's Cup, the first thing I remember is the yacht that you skippered crossing the line, and the next thing is Bob Hawke's comment. What were your reflections on that?
Well, we of course, we're halfway around the world, so we didn't find out about that until we got back to Australia. But, you know, it was typical of Bob Hawke, his ability to seize the moment. You know, that was not a pre-rehearsed line or wasn't contrived. It was typical of Hawke in terms of that was just perfect thing to say in the celebrations over in the Wild West, where he happened to be just by chance with a conference that he was attending at the time. And of course, you know, years later, you know, Bob would often say, with all the great things he achieved, you know, floating the dollar and superannuation, and you know what the gentleman was saying just before, people still remind him of the most significant thing he ever did, and that is anyone who sacks anyone today for being late is a bum. Like, it's just beautiful stuff.
And of course, he realised more than anyone else of the power of sport in Australia, particularly from the eyes of a politician. Yeah, that's right. It's sort of, you know, the sport, the America's Cup, a crazy thing. Let's face it, it was only a yacht race, but it was Australia taking on the world, and particularly the United States. And we were 3-1 down, so it represented, looking back on it, the Anzac spirit of backs to the wall and the great fight back. And of course, Bob Hawke understood and empathised with all of that. He got it. He understood. Yeah. What did he have to say to you when you got back to Australia? Oh, he's just so proud. Such a proud Aussie. You know, as the head of this of our country, Prime Minister. It was just great. You know, he was a natural sports follower and a follower of life anyway. But he also understood the significance of taking on the United States. And Ronald Reagan was then the president of the US, and so he sent messages back and forth, you know, to Ronald Reagan and all of that stuff. You know, Bob Hawke just loves that, and as he should as well. Yeah. And John, we talk about that, you know, he realised just how integral sport was a part of the fabric of Australia. And you've been obviously involved also with the Olympics. Australia went through some very dark times in the late 70s, early 80s, where it struggled sports-wise, but he helped turn that around. Yes, that's right. And interesting enough, he became co-patron of the Sport Australia Hall of Fame, of which I'm chairman of, in collaboration with John Howard. And to see these two warriors together, joined at the hip through this thing called sport, is just wonderful. In fact, I remember the first time that, you know, Bob and John hooked up in John Howard's office when they both accepted the patronage. And as Bob said, if John's in, I'm in. You know, it's just wonderful stuff. And these old soldiers talking to each other around this thing called sport is the common denominator. It was just beautiful to see and to be involved. And John, you're of course a leader in your field. What do you think set Bob Hawke apart as far as his leadership is concerned? His ability to seize the moment, you know, to capture the imagination of the country by understanding a situation, and his empathy to a situation. So in this particular case, the America's Cup, he understood the significance of this wasn't just a boat race. It was Australia, in many cases,
coming of age. You know, we're going through a tough drought at the time. We're talking about a long time ago, 1983, September. We were bushfires and we had floods. So the country, and also there was a major global recession. So the country was on its knees in many ways, and he understood the significance of the America's Cup win in terms of giving an impetus to the self-image of this country, and he understood that, and he was able to elucidate that in many ways.
John Bertrand, we really appreciate your thoughts tonight.
My pleasure.
We will have more from our guests Peter Hartcher and Mark Kenny, as well as our political editor Andrew Probyn in Canberra in just a moment. But let's bring you the thoughts of Opposition Leader Bill Shorten, who spoke at the Sydney Opera House a short time ago.
I would like to thank Craig Emerson and Blanche de Pilget for asking me to say a few words on behalf of the Labor Party and the Labor movement. Tonight, the nation and Labor are in mourning. We have lost a favourite son. Bob Hawke loved Australia, and Australia loved Bob Hawke. But his legacy will endure forever. Bob Hawke changed Australia for the better. He brought people together. He brought Australia together. He modernised our economy. He transformed our society. He protected our environment. I last had the privilege of seeing Bob last week on his back veranda, sitting out there with his beloved Blanche, supported by Craig. He had his son, the sun on his face, had a crossword in front of him, a cup of tea. He didn't speak about himself to me. He did as he always does. Asked about the ALP and the election. We all loved Bob Hawke. We'll miss him a great deal. May he rest in peace. The condolences of my party and my movement to the great Bob Hawke.
Well, that was Bill Shorten speaking in Sydney a short time ago. The current secretary of the ACTU, a role that Bob Hawke, of course, formerly held himself, said in a statement the entire union movement grieves for the passing of Bob Hawke. Medicare, superannuation, modern Australia, union movement hero.
And let's bring back in our political editor, Andrew Probyn, who's at Parliament House. And Andrew, a lot of parallels drawn between Bob Hawke and Bill Shorten, both, of course, having forged their political careers in the union movement.
That's right, both proud unionists and both Will Shorten pledging to be that consensus builder. But there is some unfinished work from the Hawke-Keating era, and it was referenced earlier by Peter Hartcher. It's in superannuation. Superannuation, an invention during those transformative years. The superannuation guarantee is at 9.5 under Paul Keating's original plan that would get to 12. Now, there was a plan to have that in place by now, but it was pushed back by governments past. The Labor Party has pledged to push ahead with an increase of the superannuation guarantee to 12% over coming years. But as Peter Hartcher referenced, this might come at the cost of wages. Now, I raised that with Paul Keating a week and a half ago, and he disputed that. He said that, in fact, it would be covered by squeezing the profits of companies. It wouldn't come from wages or lessening the wages growth. But it is a very tricky, if you're looking at a legacy issue that still has to be realised, given the current circumstances, it is going to be difficult to realise, given that wage growth has been for some time a tricky issue. Bill Shorten was speaking earlier this week and referencing Bob Hawke, as he has in recent weeks, but he was talking about should he win on May 18, he would have a meeting with business groups in Perth to talk about industrial relations issues, wages issues and the like. He was very quick to say, however, guys, that it wouldn't be an accord, but the accord was that moment and that valuable moment for Labor during those reforms to get the agreement from the union movement to allow for such things as superannuation, as Peter Hawke was talking about, to temporarily suppress the wage growth so that other virtues could be put in place. And that was the beginning of superannuation.
OK, Andrew, in fact, we might just get a comment from Peter and also just quickly too, back to Mark Kenny. Peter, just as far as wages are concerned, you were talking earlier there about Bob Hawke pushing those wages down. And now, of course, today we're talking about Bill Shorten. Will he lift the minimum wage?
Yes, the times have changed and the problem is different. We've heard the parallels, and in fact, Bill Shorten likes to talk up Bob Hawke as his role model, says, I want to be a consensus leader, says that immediately he takes the job, should he get it on Saturday, he'll bring together employers, unions to try and come to some sort of broad agreement about what to do about wages. But you're right, the problem now is the opposite problem, consensus approach to fixing problem, great. But the problem is a serious one, and the times are very different. So now the trick is how to get wages growth and, in fact, a whole rejuvenation and regeneration of the economy. It's the opposite, but it's the opposite problem now going to likely confront the same political party.
Mark Kenny, I might just get your comment on that too. You're talking about the opposite problem being the case for Bill Shorten and what he will do should he win the election?
Yeah, well, I think it's a really interesting point that both Andrew Probyn and Peter Hawke have made about Bill Shorten likening himself in some ways to Bob Hawke. I've noticed that too, that there has been this real sense of kind of invoking the idea of consensus, the idea of bringing the force of capital and labour together, getting industry and unions around the table, and just really stressing that idea of consensus. And I think there is a real appetite for it. Whether it amounted to a formal accord or not is another matter, and that's less likely. But as Peter says, the challenge now is not about getting a volatile economy that was in a sort of a boom-bust cycle as a result of high wages and wage inflation, but rather about lifting wages to get a bit of inflation going and get a bit of demand going in the economy and get things moving. And there may be scope for that. There has obviously been a fair amount of profit-taking going on by companies in the economy. It just hasn't been showing up in wages pockets, and that's the political equation, the political lever really that Bill Shorten's trying to pull in this election campaign.
Peter Hawke, another big Labor policy at this election is its climate change policy. You recently spoke to Bob Hawke about that?
Yes, I did, and I think Mark Kenny touched briefly on climate change earlier. So in his own time, Hawke had environmental issues to deal with, and I think Barry Cassidy talked about the Franklin Dam being one. There were difficult questions about protecting the environment, Kakadu National Park and other sensitive wildlife, wild places when Hawke was Prime Minister. Climate change wasn't on his agenda, so I was interested when I last had a proper conversation with Bob, which would have been somewhere between 1 and 2 years ago. Preoccupying him at that time was climate change. Uppermost in his mind was deploring what Donald Trump had done in announcing the withdrawal of the US from the Paris Climate Change Agreement, talking about the centrality of the climate change challenge and the need to take action. So in his time, it was the Franklin Dam and the Kakadu National Park, but he saw it this time very much climate change as the central problem.
Peter, thanks very much for that. We're just going to take an opportunity now to look back at the life of Bob Hawke. If you are just joining us, we're bringing you the news that one of the nation's most charismatic and popular Prime Ministers, Bob Hawke, has died today, aged 89. Mr Hawke led the country from 1983 to 1991, as well as substantial economic and industrial relations reform. The Hawke era was also marked by environmental activism.
There have been tributes today from Prime Ministers past and present.
In the spring of 1983, the nation and its new Prime Minister were high on America's Cup fever.
I tell you what, any boss who sacks anyone for not turning up today is a bum.
Robert James Lee Hawke had swept to power just 6 months earlier. His victory over Malcolm Fraser was decisive, his rise to the Labor leadership even more swift and brutal.
I believe that a drover's dog could lead the Labor Party to victory.
Mr Hawke, could I ask you whether you feel a little embarrassed tonight at the blood that's on your hands?
You're not improving, are you? I thought you'd make a better start to the year than that. It's a ridiculous question, you know it's ridiculous. I have no blood on my hands.
Born in border town South Australia and educated in Perth, the gregarious Rhodes Scholar always had the Prime Ministership in his sights. He began a successful reign as ACTU President in 1970. But it wasn't for another decade, with the resolve to swear off alcohol, he finally entered federal parliament. Bob Hawke's first term in office was marked by significant and symbolic change. He stopped the damming of the Franklin River in Tasmania.
You do not move immediately, you will be arrested.
Produced a landmark wages accord with the unions and proclaimed Advance Australia Fair the national anthem.
At previous Olympics, for instance, that you have the Brits getting up, they win a medal, and they do win one occasionally, and up this goes the God Save the Queen. Then Australians get up and it's the same anthem. Now that's crazy.
During the 1980s, Bob Hawke walked all over a divided coalition. He defeated Andrew Peacock, John Howard and even the Joe for Canberra campaign. All in all, there would be 4 election victories over nearly 9 years in office, making him Labor's longest-serving Prime Minister.
Friends, this is a moment of pride and of gratitude.
Bob Hawke's political success and consensus style largely kept his ambitious treasurer Paul Keating in check. The pair combined in their pursuit of economic reform, floating the Australian dollar, dismantling tariffs and deregulating the banking system. But leadership tension inevitably unravelled their partnership, and in 1991, on his second attempt, the young challenger brought an end to the Hawke reign.
Paul Keating polled 5 votes ahead of Bob Hawke, 56 to 51. Thank you very much.
If this was 11 years ago, I'd be getting pretty thoroughly drunk. But fortunately, fortunately for me, and even more fortunately for others, that is 11 years ago, and the only beer that will be passing my lips will be the totally non-alcoholic variety.
While he projected a knockabout character, not before or since has Australia watched a Prime Minister display such raw emotion. There was his televised confession of infidelity.
They mean that I wasn't faithful to my wife.
Was that true?
Yes.
And a breakdown over his daughter's battle with heroin.
You don't cease to be a husband. You don't cease to be a father. And my children and my wife have a right to be protected in this matter.
Bob Hawke was married to Hazel for nearly 40 years before they divorced in the mid-1990s, and he married his biographer Blanche Dalpuget. He was a Labor warrior until the end, campaigning for Kevin Rudd in 2007, then Julia Gillard in 2010.
Favourite son of the party, campaigning legend, ladies and gentlemen, Bob Hawke.
But it wasn't just the prospect of victory drawing the former PM back to the stage.
I've been everywhere.
Bob Hawke made himself available to candidates across the country, even when their prospects were grim.
The polls don't look good, we know that.
In his last press conference as Prime Minister, Bob Hawke was asked how he'd like to be remembered.
I guess as a bloke who loved his country, still does, and loves Australians, and who was not essentially changed by high office.
Well, let's bring in former Greens leader Bob Brown, who joins us now on the phone. Bob Brown, your thoughts on the passing of Bob Hawke?
Well, we've lost a great Prime Minister who notched up the best environmental record of any Prime Minister since Federation. He began, as the package just told us, with the saving of the Franklin River. He actually went to the election in 1983 saying that he would stop the dam if elected, and that was the one commitment he made on the night of that election, on 5th of March, that the dam would stop and he would give compensation to Tasmania. And after a battle through the High Court, he did just that.
Yeah, Bob, just talk us through those events, because, of course, before he came to power in late 1982, there was a blockade on the river and the proposed dam. Bob Hawke came to power in March 1983, but the Tasmanian government ignored federal regulations and legislation. So how did he overcome that problem?
Well, he took the Democrats' World Heritage Protection legislation that was then in the Senate and modified it to put it through both houses of Parliament, and that gave him the power through the Constitution's external treaties power, which enabled the Commonwealth Government to uphold an external treaty, the World Heritage Convention, overriding the court decided by 4 judges to 3, overriding the Tasmanian state's ability to manage its own lands and therefore its own rivers. So the dam, which had been well underway, they'd spent $70 million on it. The whispering bulldozer Liberal Premier of Tasmania, Robin Gray, when it was stopped. But it was the leadership of Hawke in carrying that through. And he risked seats in Tasmania. In fact, he lost every seat in Tasmania in that election in 1983, but he gained many more across the mainland because the whole country was galvanised by the beauty of the Franklin River and all those people being arrested in the rainforest. And he carried through with it. And then he went on, of course, to have a brace of other great places in Tasmania, from Uluru to the Daintree to Shark Bay and more, inscribed in the World Heritage List, and therefore protected as not just national monuments, but as part of the World Heritage suite of properties. He added more of Kakadu and the Gondwanan Forest of northern New South Wales, for example, and then took a role with Paul Keating in the leading the protection of Antarctica through the Madrid Protocol in 1997. It was signed after Bob had lost office, but he took a formidable role when America was holding out in getting that protocol up, which has protected Antarctica from mining until at least 2047.
And Bob, did you see this as his own personal convictions as opposed to doing what might have been popular?
I think there was both those things, because I think Hawke was a Prime Minister who had a very keen ear to what was going on in wider Australian society, and there was this big wish after the destruction of Lake Pedder a decade earlier by Australians to have their great places protected as national parks and World Heritage areas rather than simply going under the bulldozer. And for example, after the Franklin, he took on Joe Jelke-Peterson over the Daintree rainforest in northern Queensland, and again using that World Heritage power, he protected those rainforests which were about to be ripped to bits by land exploitation, real estate exploitation and so on. So, and Graham Richardson, of course, he brought in as his Minister for the Environment, and Richardson faced a howling mob up there, but Hawke empowered Richardson in a way we've never seen before or since to protect Australia's environment, and I think that'll be an enormous legacy for which Australians will be thanking him as Prime Minister for centuries to come.
Was that part of his leadership style, do you think, that he was not afraid to delegate and place his faith in his ministers?
Oh, that's right. And mind you, he was a politician, and he at times, I went to lobby him in Canberra over the forest of Tasmania and elsewhere, and it wasn't beyond Bob to say, well, I'll do this if you'll do that. And I I was pretty hard to deal with, I think, because I said, no, I won't do that. I won't give away this bit of the environment. And he'd immediately come back to the issue at hand. He had his go, and he'd come back to the issue at hand. And I think that style, very firm, but he had a listening ear, and he was meeting representatives of the people. I mean, famously, he did this very early in the piece to settle industrial relations and to give the unions, while keeping business on side, a bit of a leg up as far as workers' protection was concerned. But he was working across the field with community organisations everywhere, and that included the then environment movement, and famously with Rick Farley from the National Farmers Federation and Philip Toyne from the Australian Conservation Foundation, founded and funded Landcare, which was then a world sensation as far as getting farmers on side to turn back the deterioration of lands and get repair going back. And of course, adding a great new social entity to rural and regional Australia.
Bob Brown, the tributes have been coming in thick and fast. Joe Hawke, Australia's ambassador to the US and a former Liberal treasurer, says, so very sad to hear my mate and former constituent and my parents' neighbour Bob Hawke has passed away. He was a legend in so many ways. Our love to Blanche and the family. Australia has lost a bloody good guy today. Was Bob Hawke the kind of leader who could reach across the political divide?
Yes, and he showed that. And I think those pictures of him chatting away and tugging on the sleeve of Malcolm Fraser after Fraser had retired was a very good example of that. But he had his moments where I remember the testing of MX missiles, being America wanted to land some missiles in our region, testing them out, rockets, and at first Hawke seemed to be in favour of that, but there was such a furor, he backed off and said, eventually said no. I think that was to Ronald Reagan. But, like all great leaders, I think nothing's perfect, but he had a very good ear to public feeling, and that held him in good stead as one of the longest-serving Prime Ministers Australia ever had.
Bob Brown, we thank you for joining us this evening and for your thoughts on the death of Bob Hawke.
It's a pleasure to honour Bob Hawke. Thank you.
Let's bring back in our political editor, Andrew Probyn, who is at Parliament House. And once again, Andrew, hearing the many achievements of the Hawke government, and the environment, obviously, very high on that list.
Absolutely. I happened to spend a couple of years down in Tasmania in an earlier role at the ABC in the early 2000s, and the Franklin Dam issue was still talked of, and there were some echoes of that time. Of course, what happened in 1983 helped formulate the Greens movement to some degree, and we saw about 21 years later the issue of old growth forest become a big issue, and Bob Brown there referenced a fellow called Robin Gray, who was the Liberal Premier in Tasmania in 1983. The decision by the Hawke government to stop the damming of the Franklin Dam infuriated Robin Gray. Well, Robin Gray was at the centre of the old growth forests debate in 2004. He was then a director of Guns, which was a big forestry company. So, there are echoes and influences of the Hawke era that go right through the Greens movement, through the politics of Tasmania and environmentalism itself. But it is interesting in hearing tonight the protection of Antarctica. That is something that's long forgotten. As we've been talking tonight, the transformation across all sorts of portfolios is immense, be it economic, social or environmental, Andrew.
Let's bring in Mark Kenny, who's also joining us from Canberra. Mark Kenny, to pick up on that environmental theme, Tony Burke, who's the opposition's environment spokesman for Labor, he's tweeted saying the Bob Hawke I admired was the man who saved the Franklin, the Daintree, Kakadu and protected Antarctica from mining, as we've been hearing tonight. The Bob Hawke I befriended and laughed with every New Year's Eve was a fellow music fan with Blanche every summer at the Woodford Folk Festival. What a life.
Well, that's a pretty extraordinary environmental roll call there of an enormous value, enormous heritage value in those areas. So I don't think there's too many people in Australian history, indeed in world history, who can claim to have done so much in terms of leading a government that's made pivotal decisions in those areas. And you can just feel the warmth that's coming from people right across the political spectrum. The warmth from Joe Hawke there is genuine. I know that they had a good relationship. I think they played golf years ago. And as Bob Brown, a member of another party, the Greens in this case, had great, enormous respect for Bob Hawke. I actually saw a tweet from Russell Crowe, and he's described him as a great man who made this country confident. And I think that's a really telling observation about Bob Hawke, and I think one that many people who remember the Hawke era and can remember where Australia was at the end of 1983, right through the late 70s, after the dismissal of the Whitlam government, through what was some pretty bad years in the Fraser years, a lot of it afflicted by drought, but also a fair amount of policy stagnation, it must be said. And then the Hawke era came along, and things really did move in a whole lot of ways. And that, as Peter Hutch said before, a whole lot of difficult problems were actually addressed.
OK, Mark Kenny, Andrew Probyn, Peter Harcher, stay with us. Let's bring you one of the last images we have of Bob Hawke. It's this photograph taken with Paul Keating just days ago. They issued their first joint statement in 28 years, as Peter Harcher was telling us about earlier, to claim Labor's ownership of the economy, and they endorsed Bill Shorten to run it. In 1991, Paul Keating resigned as Bob Hawke's treasurer to challenge Bob Hawke for the Prime Ministership.
And let's hear from the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, who spoke earlier from Brisbane Airport.
Tonight, Australians have all learned the news of the passing of one of Australia's great Prime Ministers, and certainly Labor's greatest Prime Minister, in my view. The 23rd Prime Minister of Australia, Robert James Lee Hawke. His achievements will be spoken of in the days ahead. But the thing Australians will remember most about him was the bloke. He made Australia stronger through his contribution to public life. He had a great intellect, he had enormous passion, and he had courage. And that was able to sustain him in being the longest serving Labor Prime Minister of all time. But it was his ability to connect with everyday Australians, with a word, with that larrikin wit, with that connection and an understanding of everyday Australian life, that we will most remember Bob Hawke. I want to extend to Bob's wife Blanche, on behalf of Jenny and I, our deep personal sympathies, and to all of Bob's family, and also to acknowledge the late Hazel Hawke as well. Bob lived a full life. He lived a rich life. And in his life, he blessed many others. And for that, I think, as Australians, we can give him great thanks. One thing I remember amongst many, it was Bob Hawke who changed our national anthem to say, "Australians all, let us rejoice." And tonight, while I'm sure I extend to the Labor movement and to Bill Shorten and his party my deep sympathies on behalf of our political movement, I think we can all say, as Australians, that we rejoice in the life of Bob Hawke. We thank him for his service to our nation, and we pray now that he rest in peace. Thank you, Bob.
So that was Scott Morrison paying tribute to Bob Hawke at Brisbane Airport, West Brisbane Airport, a short time ago. Of course, it's not just ABC News that's reacting to the death of Bob Hawke. The newspapers are doing that as well. This is the front page of tomorrow's Sydney Morning Herald. That portrait of Bob Hawke and the title, the headline, The Fearless Reformer. Let's bring in the SMH's political editor, Peter Harcher, for his response. That front page, I'm sure that wasn't the front page that...
Wasn't the front page at 7 o'clock, but it was by a little bit after 8. So everybody had newspaper headlines, newspaper front pages drawn up for tonight on the sort of final messages of the two political parties and Scott Morrison and Bill Shorten ahead of the election. Of course, they were torn up in short order and quickly remade, the joys of the news business. And, you know, he was, as we've been speaking about all night, Hawke was a great reformer and will be remembered as such. But there's a sort of a tendency to look back at, you know, sort of through a warm, golden sort of hue around this as if it was just something he did and Keating helped him and it was all fine. It was really hard. And Susan Ryan was giving you a flavour earlier of how much trouble the Labor Party was having explaining to their own members how they had to be put out of work because of the reform program. The manufacturing sector as a share of Australia's economy halved. The manufacturing share of Australia's economy halved through their reforms. That's hard reform, and they had to conduct it, they had to explain it, and through Bob Hawke, partly because of the way they managed the policies, but also partly because of Bob Hawke's popularity, his bonhomie, his whole manner, was able to keep winning elections even while doing that. They faced a near constant insurrection from their own left wing. The left faction was close to 50% of the party in those times and was very restive and unhappy. And he did face a revolt eventually from the man in the photo.
How would you describe that relationship between those two men? Because it worked so well, obviously, to begin with, for the first years of, a few terms, I should say, of the Hawke government. But of course, we know full well that Paul Keating harboured his own ambitions.
Initially, it was a very tight working partnership. As the years went by, Paul Keating saw himself taking more and more of the workload and saw Bob Hawke taking less and less. And that gave Paul Keating his ambition vaulted ahead. He demanded his turn, and Hawke, in the famous so-called Kirribilli agreement, a secret agreement between the two of them, Hawke agreed that he would step aside in favour of Keating. Now, there are two things there. One is that although Keating did take on the great brunt of the economic reform work, partly Hawke was happy to let him do that because Hawke was, as I think it was Susan Ryan was saying earlier, Hawke's model of leadership was to be the chairman of the board, to delegate. You've got ministers, so you let them conduct their portfolios. Hawke didn't see it as him slacking off and Keating doing all the work. Hawke saw it as delegating and being a good Prime Minister. But eventually that agreement, the Kirribilli agreement, which would have seen a smooth handover, Hawke couldn't bring himself to do it, and Keating could contain himself no longer, and anger, frustration and bitterness boiled over.
Mark Kenny, we're running out of time because we're going to come back to you though, of course, but we are going to take the main news in just a moment. But your thoughts on that relationship, that working relationship between Paul Keating and Bob Hawke?
Well, it was very well framed just then. I think obviously it was one where they worked hand in glove, and they were really an extraordinary couple of ministers, a Prime Minister and a Treasurer, and they did so many things. But it did eventually sour, and it soured for those reasons that Keating felt like he was the sort of policy backbone of the government, and that Bob Hawke was becoming, he'd served his purpose. But the point about Hawke, I think, really, if we could sum it up, is that he was a genuine person. So when you see him in that shot, the America's Cup, or in any other shots interacting with people, this was a bloke who was both an elite level leader and a normal person at the same time. There are very few politicians that you could ever say that of.
Okay, Mark Kenny and Andrew Probyn in Canberra, thank you for joining us, and stay with us. We have Peter Harcher as well here in the studio, and we will bring you more news on the death of Bob Hawke.
Tonight, Australia's 23rd Prime Minister, Bob Hawke, has died at the age of 89.
Tonight, the nation and Labor are in mourning. we have lost a favourite son.
His achievements will be spoken of in the days ahead. But the thing Australians will remember most about him was the bloke.
He's remembered for the floating of the dollar, the wages accord, and of course...
I tell you what, any boss who sacks anyone for not turning up today is a bum.
Welcome to ABC News and our continuing coverage of the death of Bob Hawke at the age of 89. He was considered one of the nation's most charismatic and popular prime ministers. Mr Hawke led the country from 1983 to 1991. As well as substantial economic and industrial relations reform, the Hawke era was also marked by environmental activism.
In the spring of 1983, the nation and its new Prime Minister were high on America's Cup fever.
I tell you what, any boss who sacks anyone for not turning up today is a bum.
Robert James Lee Hawke had swept to power just 6 months earlier. His victory over Malcolm Fraser was decisive, his rise to the Labor leadership even more swift and brutal.
I believe that a drover's dog could lead the Labor Party to victory.
Mr Hawke, could I ask you whether you feel a little embarrassed tonight at the blood that's on your hands?
You're not improving, are you? I thought you'd make a better start to the year than that. It's a ridiculous question. You know it's ridiculous. I have no blood on my hands.
Born in border town South Australia and educated in Perth, the gregarious Rhodes Scholar always had the Prime Ministership in his sights. He began a successful reign as ACTU President in 1970. But it wasn't for another decade, with the resolve to swear off alcohol, he finally entered federal parliament. Bob Hawke's first term in office was marked by significant and symbolic change. He stopped the damming of the Franklin River in Tasmania.
You do not move immediately, you will be arrested.
Produced a landmark wages accord with the unions and proclaimed Advance Australia Fair the national anthem.
At previous Olympics, for instance, that you have the Brits getting up, they win a medal, and they do win one occasionally, and up there goes the God Save the Queen. Then Australians get up and it's the same anthem. Now, that's crazy.
During the 1980s, Bob Hawke walked all over a divided coalition. He defeated Andrew Peacock, John Howard and even the Joe for Canberra campaign. All in all, there would be 4 election victories over nearly 9 years in office, making him Labor's longest-serving Prime Minister.
Friends, this is a moment of pride and of gratitude.
Bob Hawke's political success and consensus style largely kept his ambitious treasurer Paul Keating in check. The pair combined in their pursuit of economic reform, floating the Australian dollar, dismantling tariffs and deregulating the banking system. But leadership tension inevitably unravelled their partnership, and in 1991, on his second attempt, the young challenger brought an end to the Hawke reign.
Paul Keating polled 5 votes ahead of Bob Hawke, 56 to 51. Thank you very much.
If this was 11 years ago, I'd be getting pretty thoroughly drunk. But fortunately, fortunately for me, and even more fortunately for others, that is 11 years ago, and the only beer that will be passing my lips will be the totally non-alcoholic variety.
While he projected a knockabout character, not before or since has Australia watched a Prime Minister display such raw emotion. There was his televised confession of infidelity.
They mean that I wasn't faithful to my wife.
Was that true?
Yes.
And a breakdown over his daughter's battle with heroin.
You don't cease to be a husband. You don't cease to be a father. And my children and my wife have a right to be protected in this matter.
Bob Hawke was married to Hazel for nearly 40 years before they divorced in the mid-1990s, and he married his biographer Blanche Dalpuget. He was a Labor warrior until the end, campaigning for Kevin Rudd in 2007, then Julia Gillard in 2010.
favourite son of the party, campaigning legend, ladies and gentlemen, Bob Hawke.
But it wasn't just the prospect of victory drawing the former PM back to the stage.
I've been everywhere.
Bob Hawke made himself available to candidates across the country, even when their prospects were grim.
The polls don't look good, we know that.
In his last press conference as Prime Minister, Bob Hawke was asked how he'd like to be remembered.
I guess as a bloke who loved his country, still does, and loves Australians, and who was not essentially changed by high office.
Well, for his insights, we're joined from Melbourne by ABC's Insiders host Barry Cassidy. Barry, you worked for Bob Hawke in his media office from 1986 to 1991. Your personal reflections tonight, given this must be a difficult situation for you?
Yeah, well, I think he deserves to be remembered as certainly the Labor Party's greatest leader. He won 4 elections. No other Labor leader did that. And he was a great reformer. Together with Paul Keating, he did open up the Australian economy to the world, including floating the dollar. The very first thing he did as Prime Minister was to get together the economic summit. That brought together the unions and the employers, and everybody sat around, and out of that emerged the Prices and Incomes Accord, and that had a profound influence on the Australian economy for years to come.
It was all about consensus, wasn't it, Barry?
Well, he said that. His slogan in 1983 when he first came to office was bringing Australia together. Now, as he saw it, there had been a fairly disruptive period before that of under
contrast between the two answers. I actually thought there might have been another one if you read a little more deeply into this. Scott Morrison seemed to be suggesting that apart from the US resettlement process, if you can't be cleared off Manus or Nauru via that, pretty much resigned to being a refugee, recognised by both PNG and Nauru. Slightly different take from Bill Shorten. Here it was.
They've been recognised as refugees in both of those countries for those who remain there. And see, the Refugee Resettlement Program and indeed the United Nations Treaty, what it does is ensures that people don't return to the country in which they were persecuted, and that will not happen to them.
I don't accept that the corollary of strong borders is indefinite detention. So I acknowledge the work of Malcolm Turnbull in terms, and all of the department who negotiated with the US in securing that deal. And we would redouble our efforts. We would contemplate using New Zealand as a source to resettle people and revisiting that offer from Jacinda Ardern.
Yeah, so Laura Tingle, you heard my introduction to that grab there. Did you think there's a material difference? Quite clearly, Labor is up for third country resettlement wherever they could find it. New Zealand is one. But Scott Morrison, apart from the US, seeming to suggest that it's PNG or Nauru.
That's right. He's saying that there's going to be absolutely no change in this policy, that the people who are stuck there forever. And I think Bill Shorten's made this point before. He's argued on a couple of occasions, certainly in interviews I've done with him, that the problem here is not necessarily the policy, but that it is in the enthusiasm or preparedness of government to look at alternative options. So what he said is, this government has done nothing to try to help people find some third country, and that Labor will go to greater efforts to do that. And he points to the US policy that Malcolm Turnbull prosecuted as an example of the sorts of things you can do.
And also, if you do look at the history as a guide, there's no doubt that first world resettlement options are key. There were many resettlement options under the Howard years, Canada being some, the United States, New Zealand principally, but also Scandinavian countries. There's no doubt it is simply untenable for the situation, should the coalition win the election, that they simply let these people rot, and that is the weakness of the current position with the coalition. That's why the resettlement option that was offered by Julia Gillard to Julia Gillard by John Key is the one that many, even in the coalition, suspect that they should take on.
All right, shall we go to franking credits? And again, we'll just play you a bit of an exchange there, and then we'll go to Barry and PK, because there was a reference by Sabra to events back in 1993 when Paul Keating put an all-or-nothing proposition against John Hewson and his GST and Fight Back proposal at the time. And I think more than anyone here, perhaps Barry will remember that. So Sabra simply posed the question, Scott Morrison, would you be prepared on this matter of franking credits to say, yep, we'll back the whole thing in as a tactic if we should lose this election? Here it was.
Because you're right, it was a tactic. And politics isn't about tactics. Politics is about what you believe.
I have it on good authority that the leadership team has considered this.
It's not of interest to me for this reason. I think it's a heinous tax on Australians who've worked hard all of their lives, and to be told that they have to pay a higher rate of tax than others do on their dividends based on their marginal rate of tax.
Barry Cassidy, Insider's host, and Bob Hawke's former press secretary. Well, often referred to as the larrikin leader, Bob Hawke rose from union roots to be the most popular Labor Prime Minister in history.
He loved a beer, a laugh, sport and lived life to the fullest. But the same traits that endeared him to the public also threatened to derail his career.
Bob Hawke could work a room or pub like no other, able to mix effortlessly with everyone from labourers to matriarchs and even swimwear models.
I think Bob Hawke, in my personal opinion, will end up Prime Minister.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, I think he's number one.
Well, I think Bob Hawke is the man that they really need.
I worked as a builder's labourer. I worked as labourer on the chain gang and the abattoirs. And that's where I've, in a sense, felt happy.
Hawkey, as he was nicknamed, was also fond of a beer, and at university held the world record for sculling a yard glass. Later in life, he was still happy to raise and down a glass to the delight of the masses. But his love affair with the amber fluid came to a self-imposed end when he became Prime Minister in 1983. The larrikin PM, though, shone through. He loved cracking a joke and sport, was a keen golfer and cricketer. He also rejoiced in one of Australia's greatest sporting victories, the America's Cup.
I tell you what, any boss who sacks anyone for not turning up today is a bum.
Not long after, during the annual Pollies versus Journos cricket match, a rising delivery deflected into his face, smashing his glasses. It was feared he could lose the sight in the eye, but he wasn't fazed.
How was it, Mr.
Oh, well, I have felt better, but it's okay.
Prime Minister Hawke didn't shy from unusual media opportunities, from being a guest of Molly on Countdown to playing himself in the hugely popular TV soap A Country Practice.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me to your party. I wasn't sure whether I was going to be able to make it or not.
He was also an openly emotional man, weeping at a news conference when his daughter's drug addiction was raised.
You don't cease to be a husband. You don't cease to be a father.
Bob Hawke's knockabout character certainly endeared him to the public, with his approval ratings frequently soaring to over 70%, making him arguably Australia's most loved PM.
ABC political editor Andrew Probyn remembers a poignant moment of his prime ministership.
I speak to you from the Parliament House. Bob Hawke was the first Prime Minister to be Prime Minister in this new building, opened in 1989, and there's a lot of places around this building where you have cause for reflecting on Bob Hawke. In the press gallery, there's a hilarious picture of him opening Radio Alley, and he's duelling with Andrew Peacock in the most hilarious of manners. And we also have another picture in the press gallery. I'd like to show it actually to you because I've just asked someone to take it off the wall. Now, I happen to be the captain of the parliamentary press gallery team, and we got a very famous picture of Bob Hawke framed, and we actually asked him to sign it a couple of years ago. And I'm going to show it to you here because it tells you a lot about the man as love of life. There's quite a wire there. Now, you see, it's that famous picture of him getting belted in the face during a game. It was bowled by Gary. It was bowled by Gary O'Neill, who was then a Herald reporter. It was the day before, believe it or not, the day before the 1984 election started. Now, Gary O'Neill felt terrible about this. He had just felled the Prime Minister, who was on 28 runs. And I was reliably told that he might have been out earlier in the day, but he turned to the umpire and said, "I don't think that was out, was it?" So he kept batting and then got belted in the face by Gary O'Neill. Shards of glass ended up being in his eye.
There was serious concern about his eyesight.
There was serious.
We did play some of that vision earlier, so I wonder if we can dig it up again.
Yes, we could dig it up, but so there was a young reporter who took a shard of glass from his eye. He was whisked off to Canberra Hospital, but he was back about an hour later lounging in his budgie smugglers on a banana chair. Now, the next day, the election started, and Bob Hawke decided that he would ask a one-eyed Bob Hawke, I might add at this stage, that it was first day of the election campaign. He asked Gary O'Neill to be somewhat of a victim. They strung a line between two ships in Jervis Bay, and Bob Hawke said that Gary O'Neill should be the one who was strung up between those two ships.
That is Andrew Probyn with his recollections from the Parliamentary Press Gallery. Reporter Lily Mayers has been outside the Hawke family home in Sydney with details of a public memorial planned for Bob Hawke.
A statement has been released by Bob Hawke's wife, Blanche Dalpouget, this evening. It said the former Prime Minister died peacefully here in his Northbridge home in Sydney's north. The 89-year-old is survived by his wife, Blanche, as well as their 3 children and Bob Hawke's stepchildren. The statement said there will be a private funeral held for Bob Hawke's family. That will then be followed by a public memorial held in Sydney in the coming weeks. The statement then listed some of Bob Hawke's proudest achievements. They included, of course, establishing Medicare, increasing the proportion of children finishing high school in the country, positioning Australia into the Asia century, having a role in ending apartheid in South Africa and protecting Antarctica from mining. The statement pointed out how Bob Hawke and Paul Keating's partnership led Australia into a more modern economy and led to an unprecedented period of recession-free growth in the country. The statement made special mention of the role of Bob Hawke's father, Reverend Clem Hawke. The statement said Reverend Clem Hawke told Bob that if you believed in the brotherhood of God, then you must then believe in the brotherhood of man. But that today Bob would add the sisterhood of women. The statement ended by saying how loved Bob Hawke is by his family, his friends and his colleagues. And we can expect that love to continue outpouring until that public memorial is held in Sydney in the next couple of weeks.
Lily Mayers reporting from outside Bob Hawke's home in Sydney. Well, Bob Hawke was the atypical Prime Minister, a larrikin, but also a man who showed his emotions. He was at home in a pub as he was in a concert hall.
And in 2009, at the age of 79, he even took on the conductor duties at the Sydney Opera House. Let's have a look. What a fabulous moment. Goes to show he was a showman.
Oh, really, truly was. Don't you think that was a really apt piece of footage to come to a close of our coverage on?
Absolutely, because so many people have been remembering fond memories of Bob Hawke, including Labor figures, as you'd expect, including Anthony Albanese. Tonight he said, a Labor legend has passed tonight. Bob Hawke showed us how to govern and transformed modern Labor. Respect.
Labor's Tony Burke tweeted that the Bob Hawke I admired was the man who saved the Franklin, the Daintree, Kakadu and protected Antarctica from mining. And the Bob Hawke I befriended and laughed with every New Year's Eve was a fellow music fan with Blanche every summer at the Woodford Folk Festival. What a life.
And the current Secretary of the ACTU, a role that Bob Hawke formerly held himself, said in a statement, this is Sally McManus, the entire union movement grieves for the passing of Bob Hawke, Medicare superannuation, modern Australia union movement hero.
And there really have been so many tributes that people have paid on social media. We haven't been able to get to all of them, but Paul Keating has issued a statement and he said, with Bob Hawke's passing today, the great partnership I enjoyed with him passes too, a partnership we forged with the Australian people. Julia Gillard, the former Prime Minister, she paid tribute, touching tribute to Bob Hawke, and she went on to say, when I last saw Bob, he was facing his own mortality with a sense of calm. He was ready and taking great comfort looking back on a life so well lived.
And of course, Karina, this comes around 36 hours before we go to the polls. So the newspapers have had to put their election coverage to one side, and here we have the Sydney Morning Herald, the fearless reformer.
We can move on to the Daily Telegraph, which has a double-page spread on Larrikin leader legend.
And from the Northern Territory News, Bob Hawke.
With a pint of beer in fitting NT News tribute. Well, that's the latest from us. Stay with us. Beverly O'Connor is continuing our coverage of the death of former Prime Minister Bob Hawke. Thanks for your company tonight.